So Dina is the director of the Contemporary. She was named the director in the spring of 2013. In that same year, she was named in the top 10 people to watch under 30 by the Baltimore Sun, which was a really fantastic group of people. And that's, I think, when I first became familiar with her work. She has an MFA in curatorial practice from MICA. She was a curator in residence at Gallery CA. And she's a co-dean of the Baltimore chapter of the Awesome Foundation, which you should definitely look up because it's awesome. But what I think is most interesting about Dina's work is really at her core, she's a curator. And I think, you go look at historical definitions of curator, and they almost sound like security guards, like they are called the keeper of a cultural institution or the watchdogs of our artifacts. So I kind of like picture Dina in like a sculpture garden, like with the big ass whistle, and she's like keeping everybody off, which would be really amazing. But I think that is a really shifting and changing definition. And so I think that Dina provides a really interesting path to watch, both as she redefines what a museum is, as the Contemporary moves forward, and also how she redefines what curation is. So you may call it an active producer of meaning, that meaning is created by the curator for the audience, by what artists they put together, or what framework comes from whatever is curated. Perhaps a catalyst of dialogue, something like that. But that definition continues to move forward, and I think it's what's most exciting about watching Dina create something with this particular project. So with that, please welcome Dina Haggag.
Thanks, Good morning. I didn't even think I knew 100 people that would wake up this early. What are you all doing here? Thank you, Katie, and everybody else at Creative Mornings. Yeah, when Katie first asked me to talk about minimalism, I frankly struggled with it, and I literally spent 3 weeks going, how am I going to talk about minimalism as it relates to our museum that does not have a building or a collection or any real big assets of any kind, really? How is that going to work? Because sometimes I'm very slow. So I sort of, that crashing realization came on me that I work for a museum that does not, in fact, have a building or a collection. And while I could talk about that for 20 minutes, I think it's actually more interesting to look at how we operate philosophically and from a programming stance in a way that we think is minimal, if you will. So again, I direct the Contemporary. It's a nomadic, non-collecting art museum. That's just a fancy way of saying that we do not have a building at all, and we do not necessarily collect or obtain objects or artworks of any kind. And to get sort of into that whole story, I'd like to rush everybody through our timeline a little bit and how we came to be. My mother jokes that I work for a museum that has a bigger commitment-phobic problem than I do, so that's always kind of clever. The Contemporary was founded in 1989 by Baltimore-based curator George Sissel, and it was very much at that point founded to be intentionally nomadic. So there was never any hope of getting a building then. And it was formed very much in reaction to traditional art museums. Who here has been to an art museum, today notwithstanding? Raise your hand. All right, so we all know what an art museum is. In the 80s, I think George was really interested in seeing how art museums were functioning for local audiences and how they could bring art to those audiences rather than have the audience come to them. So basically, they roam the city, and they did projects in places like the Conservatory in Druid Hill. Traditional art museums like the BMA were very great partners. The Maryland Historical Society, where we most notably in 1992 opened Minding the Museum with Fred Wilson, who was an artist that sort of mined their collection and was looking to make sure that the history represented at the Historical Society was racially and socially accurate. So for example, looking at issues of slavery and indigenous peoples in Maryland for a few centuries and not just looking at this, bust of a white guy history type thing. And that was kind of a huge, big blockbuster success. So much so that this small nomadic museum was able to grow into a building, which was really phenomenal in 10 years to grow that much support from your local home base, but also financially to take on this type of commitment. We were at 100 West Center Street, which is just the next block over, and the Walters was actually our landlord. So it's pretty great that we're here today. It existed there for about 10 years and did fairly traditional exhibitions in a more Kunsthal type space. They still occasionally went out into the community and did on-site work, as demonstrated in that last image at the bottom. But for the most part, they stayed within their walls. They did that for about 10 years, and then our lease was up. And the board at that time, the board and the director at that time took the Contemporary back to a nomadic operating model while they looked for a new building. And at some point between losing this initial building and looking for another one, they made what I would like to say the greatest decision of all time to go underground and really reevaluate their mission. I think at this point in time, we're now in 2011-ish. Museums were struggling. Museums are still struggling today. This is not easy. Funding is sparse, resources are scant, and there are a lot of problems that museums are facing. So before they went on to marry another building, they really wanted to take a look at their mission. And they were in this place where they had an organization that, for the first 10 years operated nomadically, and for the latter had a building. And where do they go from there? And they embarked on what they called a thought partner process that lasted roughly 2 years. And I joined them about a year into it as a graduate student at MICA, where I was studying, like Katie mentioned, under George Sissel, who had founded this museum in the 80s. And with his blessing, I worked with Karen Stultz, who's in our audience, and can you raise your hand, Karen? Is the director of community engagement at MICA, was a trustee then, still is today. And I worked with her on an independent study where we really looked at Baltimore. Because people kept saying, you should go back to nomadic, it was so successful. But Baltimore was a very different city in the 80s and 90s than it is today. The museums are far more robust, there's way more galleries, there's just a much more active art scene. So how do you do that? And is there really even a need to fill? And then if we were to go nomadic, how are organizations doing that? There's nomadic organizations all over the world. How are they operating? What were their challenges? What were they sort of facing, and how were they addressing those things? And by answering those first two questions, we were able to determine how the Contemporary would reopen, if it would at all. So again, we started with the city, which is magnificent, and I love it, and it has a tremendous amount of cultural resources. And we spoke to damn near every single one of them, and we went, hey, what's missing? Do we need to reopen? And we were met with a resounding yes. And we were met with, don't get a building, it's not a commitment you need to marry. So then we talked to people nationally. This map started geographically, and then it became such a pain in the ass that I was like, I don't even care where Santa Fe is, I'm just gonna put this down here. But we spoke to organizations all over the country, and we asked them, do you see how annoying this is? But, and every color was like, they have $1 million budget. This is not at all accurate. Anyway, but we spoke to all these organizations, and we sort of asked them again about their processes. How do you do this nomadically today? How do you sort of compete, and how do we compete against all these organizations? And that was phenomenal. That was probably the strongest part of our research, to see how Baltimore can stay inherent to itself, but speak to a much larger national and international conversation. And from there, we thanked all those people, the hundreds and hundreds of people we spoke to, both in Baltimore and beyond, for sort of helping us on this process. And we walked away with roughly these 12 things that we knew we needed to do if we stood any chance at survival. And the three I'm going to focus on now, because they relate most to minimalism, is A, that we are nomadic. So not marrying that kind of commitment, minimizing that huge, huge expense. 4, transparency. At what point do you say, I want to minimize the degrees of separation between every patron we have and the highest, most governing power at our organization? I want to be so transparent that people actually feel a part of this place. And lastly, collaboration. Because in my head, that's just building off existing assets. And it's minimizing your need to need and sort of sharing, if you will. And that's something I think we're really, really focusing on now. We relaunched this past December 2013. It was pretty open, and again, in the name of transparency, we sort of gave people all the information that we needed. We have a small staff, another very, I don't know if I'd call it lovingly minimal, but it's certainly minimal. Lou Zhang, who's our business manager, is in the audience today, if anybody has questions for her later. Everybody that touches our organization is on our website from our volunteers. We work with a few students, Kirsten Poulsen-House and Bianca Bibraj, who are also in our audience today. And everybody has access to any one of us at any point in time. Our board is also on our website, which is incredibly important. We have a 20-person board, myself included. We make every decision on behalf of this place, from how the money is spent to whether or not it stays open to how the programming is run. And you should absolutely know who we are, seeing as how we are a nonprofit and essentially are using public interest money to run this place. Our board is phenomenal, and I love hearing when board members are stopped on the streets, when people know who they are, all of their bios are on our website, and we want to be transparent in that capacity. And as we grow, we want to be transparent about where we're putting our money and how we're sort of using the resources that this place has. We have a curatorial advisory council, 6 professionals nationally who are experts in their field. Again, we want people to know who the brain power is behind this place, and these are the 6 individuals that sort of help us guide our programming. And they're from everywhere, from LA to New York to Houston, and they're all very wonderful. And for programming, so we sort of set up the infrastructure and the governance of this place, and then we thought, well, how do we open now? Traditionally, museums open with exhibitions or projects, and frankly, we just weren't there last year. That takes a tremendous amount of time. You need to leverage the resources, give artists the space, find the appropriate partners, and that was nothing we could have done. So we kept thinking, how do we reopen with something that's still thoughtful and sort of steeped in education? And we thought we'd open with a speaker series. And then we thought, well, how do we do this? Because one thing we're also interested in is changing the curatorial model, as Katie spoke to earlier. I have my own taste, and so does everybody on our staff. And to speak on behalf of all of contemporary art with our own very individual voices is a little problematic for us, especially if we're looking to be this collaborative and open space. So we went back to one of our thought partner meetings. Again, we spoke to everybody in the city before we reopened, and we spoke to a lot of galleries. There are dozens of galleries in this city, and they're everything from the basements of warehouses to places that net $3 million a year. And we spoke to them, and we said, are you interested in helping us curate this series? And they went, hell yeah. So we did that. We asked every single one of the DIY galleries here to send us their dream list of artists. If you could invite anybody to the city of Baltimore to speak, who would that person be? We ended up with 13 speakers for the year, and the bill ran the contemporary and, in this case, guest spot gallery present artist Coco Fusco. This did a number of things for us. A, it minimized our access to our first direct and primary audience, which is artists. Our talks have been fairly successful. We've booked pretty much every single one, and that was nothing we could have done on our own. We needed these galleries, and we needed their audiences, and we needed their taste to make that happen. Again, minimize the amount of bureaucratic crap between you and your main audience. This was also helpful for us because it gave us an extremely diverse list of speakers. Again, not just my taste, not Ginevra's, not Lou's, not the board's, but 13 very distinct galleries with all of their voices. So these are just some stills from some of our talks. They're all at the Baltimore School for the Arts, which is right next door here in Mount Vernon. We had 6, we had 7. We have 6 more coming up starting in September. We're taking a little break this summer. Something else we started doing is when we were talking to these galleries, we thought, how do you also minimize the distance between a master artist and everybody else? And we were dropping a lot of cash and a lot of resources to bring these people here, and we wanted to maximize, in this case, that output. So every single artist that visits our museum has to do studio visits with artists or classrooms here. So in that case, this is artist Nick Cave in the center doing a classroom visit with the Baltimore School for the Arts. This is artist Wayne White and his wife Mimi Pond doing a studio visit with local artist David Ubius. So again, looking at ways that we could minimize the distance between these extraordinarily successful and smart artists we were working with and the extraordinarily successful and smart artists we have here. How do we become that sort of unifying and collective agent? And then lastly, in terms of minimalism, and I have no real slides for this one because we're still sort of setting it up. So one thing we're working on now is minimizing access to resources, or maximizing access to resources and minimizing sort of the need for them in a way. We had this huge museum, and now we have a warehouse space with a whole bunch of equipment and stuff. And we have art books and projectors and monitors, and we're running a program to make sure that artists and gallerists here have access to all of those resources and can rent them directly for us free of charge. Again, as a way of just saying, how can the museum play a much stronger role in the city to minimize need in a capacity? So yeah, that's pretty much all I got for now. We are a museum without a building, we are a museum without a collection, but we are a museum with a hell of a lot of high hopes and goals, and I hope that you will join us at our events. Everybody take your iPhones out, or I'm seriously gonna give you dates, so everybody take your phones out. This is another way, minimize your need to mail people things and just tell them what they need to know. Our next talk is September 4th at the Baltimore School for the Arts, starting at 7, and that is Andrew W.K. in collaboration with Current Space. How many people here know who Andrew W.K. is? All the people that didn't raise their hand should absolutely come, because it's insane. Yeah. Thank you very much.